we've got ourselves the Skyzone 04X Pros. These are a brand new goggle that a lot of people don't even really know about yet. That's because they haven't sent them out to any big YouTubers for review. So the YouTubers who are talking about them are typically only doing it in a live stream. So there haven't really been any big videos about these goggles, no big announcements. They're actually kind of hard to find. Even if you Google them, you have to pretty much go to the website and search specifically for the 04X Pro to even be able to find them. But the people who do know about them, they are saying that it is not worth the $500. And that kind of is really the burning question, isn't it? Are these worth the $500 that they are currently asking? They do give you a $10 coupon pretty much anytime you do anything. So I only paid $4.90 for them, but that is nonetheless a pretty high price tag, especially when you're talking about these other premium goggles. The WalkSnail X are about $465, I believe, and then the HDZero goggles are on a sale for Black Friday right now. I think they are only $495 themselves. So why would you ever buy an analog goggle like this when you can get these premium HD goggles for the same price? And honestly, for a lot of people, you wouldn't. This is not a goggle that's going to be for everyone, but for me, I thought it was worth the money, and so I'm going to explain why. Maybe you would or would not want these goggles and what kind of things you need to know and be looking at with them. So first, I just want to say that they are very similar to the 04X. Pretty much the only thing that has changed are the screens inside, and I just want to show you a real quick unboxing experience of that so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. I did already unbox it, but I just kind of wanted to go through this experience to show you what it was like, because it was kind of a little surprising to me. So as you can see on the side of the box, they wrote with a Sharpie 04X Pro. So clearly we know what we're getting in here. And then this is the box that it all comes in. So as you can tell, it just says 04X, and I did have 04X goggles with this box, and so I'm very familiar with how the 04X box looks, and this one is identical. So I was a little bit thrown off by that, and I was a little bit worried that maybe they had sent me the wrong goggles. And when you open it up, inside you get a manual, which is, as you can see, for the 04X and the 040 and the 04L. So once again, there's no mention of the Pro anywhere. Now I have taken this bigger box out already. I've not actually taken out this smaller box. This is where the antennas and the cables and everything are. In the bigger box, you of course get the Skyzone goggles, as you would expect, and the goggles came inside. I believe they were inside of the case when they shipped, and these had a plastic wrap around them. But pretty much really the only thing that was different about this unboxing experience was literally just the goggles that were inside them, because everything else is the same as the 04X. I mean, it even says 04X without the Pro all over the place. The only place that said Pro was the actual box itself that it shipped in the Sharpie marker. And then I'm also realizing that it does actually say Pro on the side of the goggles there as well. So I was almost a little bit worried that they gave me the 04X, but there were a couple giveaway signs to let me know that they were in fact the Pros. So the first obvious one is going to be the color. It's now more of a matte black instead of the glossy, which is what I had before. Also, it's very easy to verify by taking this cover off and seeing the fan inside. And then finally, the thing that was really obvious to me was actually turning these goggles on and looking through them and seeing how much bigger the screen was than the 04X. But aside from those things and the Sharpie marker that was actually on the box that said Pro there, That's pretty much the only thing that let me know that these were actually pro goggles. So it really seems like they are trying to basically re-release the O4X, but just with the new updated HDMI input and refresh rate on the screens to support that 100 FPS. Now, these are also pretty new though, and it kind of seems like they were kind of doing a rush deal, and actually only the black ones were available. Everything else is pre-order. So perhaps when it comes to later units, we might start to see some of the wording updated here. But as for right now, it's completely all O4X, and it's just literally the different goggle with the different screens that is inside. So really the main difference between these and the O4X, the primary performance difference that you're going to see are that these have new screens in them that support 100 Hertz refresh rate, and the HDMI input also supports 100 FPS. Other than that, they are pretty much the same exact goggles as the O4X. Obviously, we do have the new color change that I talked about. We have the fan in here, which I can show you really quick. There's that fan that you can see in the module bay, and that does mean that you're not going to be able to use a second module. This is the first one. This is the second module bay where you typically would run a second module for quadversity on the O4X. You're not going to be able to do that on the O4X Pro due to the fan here. But by and large, these are basically the same exact goggle. Now, with that screen change, you're also getting a higher resolution, so you are getting the full 1080p. So that means that you're able to get the full 1080p resolution out of your HD systems in the modes that support it. And you're also getting a much larger field of view. And I know that this is something that some people were concerned about. I personally was really concerned about it, because if you want to look at other goggles historically, there are not any of them that have been able to pull off a field of view that is as large as what these goggles are saying they're giving you in as small as a form factor as what you're getting right here. So you can see these things are pretty tiny, and you have the screens inside as well as the optics that you're looking through, and that's kind of all of this space it has to actually magnify the screens to be as large as what they appear to be for your eyeballs. So typical issues that you have when you try to do that would be like the Orca goggles, which had a lot of distortion. It would be like the DJI goggles 2, which have a lot of vignetting issues. You basically can't see the entire screen all at once without pushing the goggles around. And so really, in my opinion, there are only 2 goggles, kind of 3 goggles, that have had large screens with good optics. And one of those, I would say probably the worst of them, is the HDZero2s. And they kind of have like the weird like circular optics, and they had to like push it really close to your face, and then you have your eyelashes rubbing on them. That was a whole thing from like many years ago. So if you've been around for a while, you know what I'm talking about. And I don't think those ones were bad, but they weren't as ideal. So the Skyzone O4X optics did it really well. And those ones, I think personally, were pretty much perfect. They had about that 45, 46 degree field of view, and everything is completely clean and in focus and sharp edge to edge with no vignetting. And then the third goggle that I would say would do it would be the HDZero goggles, although they kind of cheated because I believe they're actually using bigger screens, so they don't have to do as much magnification. I might be wrong on that, but I think that's how it works. And so they're able to essentially get the same field of view as what you would get out of the O4X, but it probably was just a little bit easier for them to do that. And they also are using a bigger goggle as well, slightly bigger, but that probably helped. So when you're talking about going even larger than what these smaller goggles have done, and you're still doing it in this tiny form factor, because the Skyzone shell, I would say, is actually probably the smallest and lightest form factor that you can get out of any goggles out there. They make the HDZero goggles look huge. So getting that big of a field of view out of these goggles, I think they're 50 to 52 degrees or something is kind of actually questionable. So for myself, and I know a lot of other people, we really were like, can they actually do this? And so that was pretty much the first thing that I did, is I tried them on and I really wanted to see what those screens look like, and they were definitely noticeably larger. That's not something that I typically am even paying attention to, but as soon as I put them on, I noticed how big those screens were, and everything was in focus, everything was sharp edge to edge, and it just looked so good with no vignetting. And so I'm pretty stoked about that, because for me personally, that was my primary concern about these goggles. Just looking at a spec sheet, you really just don't know what it's gonna look like on your face. And it's also not really something that I can show you very well either. But all that to say, I was definitely very relieved, because I felt like I took a risk buying these goggles without there being any reviews and just not knowing what those optics would look like. Now, the concern that most other people have, of course, is that this is an analog goggle. So why would you pay so much money for an analog goggle when you can pay the same amount of money and get HD? Well, to answer that question, I think it's just important to know that if you're gonna compare these goggles to the Walksnail X goggles or the HDZero goggles, what you need to know is that actually all three systems can do Walksnail, HDZero, and analog. It's just a matter of how good those three systems will do those things. Now, since I primarily fly analog, that is something that is really important to me. So first we can talk about the Walksnail X goggles, which pretty much only reviewers have at this point in time. But Mads Tech did do a latency test, and he showed us that the Walksnail goggles are getting significantly worse latency when they're doing analog. And I've also heard that they can't record analog DVR because of that. I did hear somebody mention that maybe that will be a firmware update or something, but ultimately I don't really know. And it's clear that analog is not the priority of those goggles. And for me, since analog is my priority, that's part of why I like these. So now to compare the HDZero goggles in terms of analog, there's a lot of things I could say about that, but what I will leave it at is that we have had plenty of people locally who have used HDZero goggles for analog, and we've all had a lot of problems. I tried it out personally, and I do have to say that it was actually an amazing looking image. It pretty much looked HD to my eyes because of the deinterlacing capabilities that the HDZero goggles have. But there was just all kinds of other issues that have happened, and some people say that the updates have fixed them, some people say they haven't, some people say it's because they had to use a different video decoder, which is what you need to be able to get the HDMI input and output. But regardless, that all has kind of made me just a little bit wary about using HDZero goggles for my analog flying. And I know that pretty much none of the pilots that I fly with locally, even though a lot of them have HDZero goggles, pretty much none of them are using them for analog. Whenever they fly analog, they will bust out an old set of analog goggles. And so that is kind of testimony alone for me to say, you know what, maybe this isn't the analog goggle for me. But on top of that, the way that you're adding an analog module to the HDZero goggles is that you're adding a little module bay to the side here, and then it kind of sticks out even further. And considering the HDZero goggles are already kind of the widest goggle on the market, when you're adding an analog module to the side and making them even wider, it makes it a lot harder to fit them in your bag. And it also makes it harder for them to fit in any kind of case like this as well. And so for me, primarily flying analog, I have always felt like the experience was much cleaner on my O4X goggles, and now hopefully that will translate to my O4X Pro goggles, and that's why I have stuck with them. Now, this isn't a video to say whether you should or shouldn't be flying analog. That's a whole other topic, but what I am saying is that when it comes to analog, I do feel like the O4X Pro are the #1 choice, at least out of those three goggles, for being able to fly analog. Now, when it comes to HD systems, you're gonna have to use the HDMI port on the bottom of the goggles and add an HD VRX to the front to be able to get that HD video. And the problem with this is that basically anytime you are converting that HD signal to be HDMI, it seems like coming out of the VRX, you're getting about 9 milliseconds of extra latency. So that makes it a pretty simple thing to figure out which goggle is going to be the best goggle for using Walksnail. And that's because that if you're going to use Walksnail on these goggles or on the HDZero goggles, you're going to get about 9 milliseconds of extra latency compared to the Walksnail X goggles. Now, I haven't tested that 9 milliseconds myself. That's just kind of going based off of what other respected members of the community have tested and reported. But nonetheless, the point is that you do get a little bit extra latency using the HDMI port. And that's probably the main downside of these goggles, I would say, compared to the other ones. Now, I also personally have had a not very good time trying to fly Walksnail in the 60 FPS. I feel like the latency is just too high for me. And so really what you want if you're going to be flying the Walksnail system is the ability to do that 100 FPS. And the Skyzone O4X do not have that. The O4X Pro do. And so really by upgrading to the O4X Pro, the primary thing that you're really getting out of that is just your ability to realistically use Walksnail, because I felt like that's something I didn't have on my O4X, and that's why I wanted to upgrade. So even with that extra 9 milliseconds of latency, I feel like I will be able to still enjoy Walksnail now. And I'm going to do some testing with that later, and we can see if that actually holds up to be true. If it doesn't, then that kind of really makes me feel like these goggles might not be that big of an upgrade over something like the O4X. But nonetheless, both these goggles and the HDZero goggles can do that Walksnail 100 FPS over the HDMI input, and you're still going to get that benefit from each one. Now, truthfully, I'm not sure if the HDZero screens actually will have the 100 Hertz refresh rate or if it's just 90, but nonetheless, you still can get the 100 FPS mode into it, and you are getting better latency performance out of it. And so what I would say is it's probably a toss-up for second place between the O4X Pro and the HDZero goggles for using Walksnail. It's just kind of a matter of which goggle you prefer, because both of them are probably going to be pretty similar in terms of their Walksnail performance. Now, if you do want to fly HDZero, then the HDZero goggles are your best choice, hands down, and there's actually a couple reasons for that. So again, the first reason is just going to be that you have the HDZero system built into the goggles, so you don't have to go through the HDMI port. And what that means is that you are going to have about an extra 9 milliseconds of latency saved when you are using the HDZero goggles instead of the O4X Pros or the Walksnail X with the HD video receiver attached to the front. Now, if it wasn't obvious to you already, now it probably is. But if one of these video systems is the primary one that you want to fly, then the goggle that goes along with that system is probably the one that you want to buy. But with HDZero, they actually even take it a step further, and that's because HDZero does have 90 FPS cameras, but only the goggles can actually receive and display that 90 FPS signal. So when you're talking about using an HDZero VRX on the O4X Pros, the VRX is actually only going to be able to output 60 FPS, and that means that you're only getting 60 FPS in the goggles. And so it seems like if you were going to use the 90 FPS camera on the HDZero goggles versus 60 FPS on the Skyzone O4X Pro, you are looking at a difference of about 15 milliseconds. So again, don't quote me on that. I'm kind of just getting these numbers from elsewhere, but that is a pretty significant difference. And I know that the 5-inch racing pilots are definitely gonna be wanting to buy the HDZero goggles for that reason. And even probably a lot of freestyle pilots are gonna enjoy 15 milliseconds less of latency. However, that being said, I have been using HDZero on my Whoops for about a year or more now, using the old O4X, so not these Pros, but the old one. And obviously that means I'm using 60 FPS there, and I have never had a problem with that latency. I'm not the fastest pilot ever out there, but I am pretty quick around the track. And so I do have a fairly high level of confidence in saying that most people are not going to have a problem using 60 FPS HDZero into a goggle like the O4X Pro using the HDZero video receiver. And that's part of the reason why I had confidence going with these goggles and not the HDZero goggles, is just because I had already seen the latency using the external VRX and it was not a problem for me. I didn't even notice it. I'll also point out that at this time, there are no 90 FPS cameras for Tiny Whoops. And since I am primarily a Tiny Whoop pilot, that means that I'm not really going to be able to benefit from that 90 FPS option that is exclusive to the HDZero goggles anyway. Really, the only difference in latency that I'm going to be getting is going to be the difference in latency between using an HDMI port and not. Now, there's all kinds of other differences as well. Like, for instance, these O4X Pros only have an HDMI input, and also you're not going to have the extra features like the different Wi-Fi capabilities and things that go along with that with these O4X Pro goggles. But those are features that I personally don't really want anyway, because it seems like they are more prone to cause problems with the goggles, and then you have to do all of these constant updates. And that is not something that I personally enjoy doing. I never once updated my O4X goggles in the entirety of the time that I had them, which was over a year and a half. And so I am kind of looking forward to never having to update these ones either. Instead, I think it's just going to be a completely rock solid performance from them, doing exactly what I expect at all times without any kinds of problems. And that is personally what I would rather have over these extra features that I might only use once anyway. So just to recap, why would I buy these analog goggles when there are HD options out there? Well, for one, I just feel like the other premium options for HD goggles cannot actually live up to my standard for what I require out of an analog system. And again, I do primarily still fly analog, and I know a lot of you guys do as well. Now, that being said, I do feel like I have had a pretty good experience using HDZero on my O4X. But what the O4X Pro allows me to do is now hopefully have a good experience flying Walk Snail as well. So basically what that means is that theoretically with these goggles, I should be able to have a great experience flying analog, HDZero, and Walk Snail. So now we basically have a goggle that can actually do it all. And that's not something that I have really felt about any goggle ever up until this point. And so that is the reason why I definitely feel like I really would prefer this goggle over everything else, and why you might as well. Again though, if you know that you are primarily going to be flying Walk Snail or HDZero, then either of those goggles would be a better choice for you. Obviously, if you primarily fly DJI, then you'll also need to pick up a set of DJI goggles. So it's all really just kind of dependent on what you want to fly. And if you want to see if Walk Snail is now viable for racing, now that we have 100 FPS goggles and we also have the new race mode, then I'm going to be trying that out with my Walk Snail Whoop on the track alongside my HDZero Whoop. Again, this is just going to be 60 FPS because we don't have a 90 FPS camera, and also because the VRX into the goggles does not support that. But if you want to see how these two HD systems actually compare in terms of racing now, then I'm definitely going to be testing that out on the track soon. So stick around if you want to see that. So that's all I have for this video. Let me know in the comments if you think the O4X Pros are overpriced and a little bit too little too late now that we have so many HD options. Or let me know if you are actually pretty curious and intrigued by these goggles, and I will see you guys in the next one.